I am here in this version of my dining room that has been lit in some exciting ways, and now I am just about ready to add some particle effects. So I will start by going over to my content browser, and in the content browser I am going to go up to content where I've got these folders, my HDRI, materials, props, and textures. I'm going to make a new folder for particles. Just like with all of Unreal's other folders, when this is created, it will be made both here in my content browser and here in my file browser as well. So I can come right on in here, right click, and create a new particle system. So I will call this one Dust Cloud, and we'll use it to make a dust cloud. After that, we'll make some variations. I will do some sparks, maybe a little bit of fire, and we'll talk about some of the options that you've got. The first thing that I want to do is introduce you to the particle creation system. So I will double click in here. That is going to load these particles into the particle creation system in Unreal, which is called Cascade. And you'll see why as soon as it opens. I'll just take this and dock it right up here. The reason it's called Cascade is this part up here, where I have the ability to create an emitter or multiple emitters, and each one has these individual modules that cascade downwards. With these emitters, when they're selected, they will show up here in the viewport, and anything that I have selected here will also be visible here in my details. There's a graph editor down here, and if you're familiar with graph editor animation from other classes, you'll probably see some words that look pretty familiar. We won't be doing much with the graph editor. It's not one of the more advanced features of the system. That's okay. We'll be focusing mostly on the details and this section up here, which is the viewport. So to go through this quickly, in the viewport I have View, which will allow me to view overlays, like particle count. The particle count is already loaded, it's down here, and you can see that you can get other things like events, times, memory, that's all good. In my view modes, I can also switch between wireframe, unlit, lit, and shader complexity. So if your computer is having problems, you can always switch over to an unlit mode or a wireframe mode, and that will show you the basic outline of the particle. Right now, my particles look like these little plus signs, which is could be interesting. You can move around in the viewport in 3 dimensions, so you can look at this thing from all sides, which again could be interesting. Hard to say. We'll be changing that pretty soon, but before we do, I just want to go through a few more things. Up here, this is my emitter, and best practice states that you right-click on it, and immediately, before you do anything else, go over here to emitter and rename emitter. Because this is my dust cloud, I will say dust emitter. And that way, if I do have multiple emitters, they can all have different names. I get this little thumbnail of the shape, and over here I am currently looking at the particles. I can also solo them, so if I do have multiple emitters, I can look at them one at a time. Under this, I have a blank space. The blank space is to allow me to insert type data. What type data would let me do is let me change the type of particle. By default, it just makes a really basic particle, which is fine. But if you wanted to do something like a mesh particle so that you could have, I don't know, a school of fish, you could switch this over to, say, new mesh data, and now you'll see it says mesh data here. And I can take this, select it, and it's set to particle cube, but you'll see that I can put in any of my meshes. We'll use this candle holder and just emit a whole bunch of candle holders. It's so beautiful. Let me undo that. I'll just Control Z back and get rid of the mesh data. Underneath that, I have some required elements. The required elements let me set up a material for the particle. This is the default particle material, and we'll be changing that in the next section. This will also let me set the default position for the emitter, the rotation, and the screen alignment, which I am going to set to velocity so that I can adjust the velocity in multiple ways. Other than that, there's not really much to do here. Eventually I will be going back and changing the shader, but we don't have one yet. So I just want to go through what all of these things do really quickly. Spawn is under required, and spawn controls the rate of spawning. So if I twirl these things down, it's set to constant, and it's set to 20 particles per whatever unit Unreal uses. If I want fewer particles, I can turn this number down. Now I've got 1 particle per unit. If I want more, I can turn it up. You probably don't want to go too far, but maybe you do. Maybe you want a really dense mesh of particles. I'll keep this to 20 for now. There's also a rate scale, which you can twirl down. And again, it's set to constant, but you can change this too. Everything in here is something you can play with. So required sets the shape of the particle. Spawn tells you how many particles there are. The next thing I have is lifetime, and lifetime tells me how long the particles live. By default, there's a min and a max. They're both set to 1. If I want the particles to live a little longer, I can set this up to 10, and now you'll see that the particles go much higher because now they're living a lot longer. On the other hand, if I don't want them to live that long, I can set this back to 1. They'll be nice and short. Maybe some of them don't even make it that far. Maybe I set this to 0.1, and now you'll see not all of them make it all the way up to a full value of 1. The initial size does just what it suggests. It sets the initial size of the particles. These are by default 25 units, which is pretty big. I'm going to set them all back to maybe a max of 2 and a min of 1. And now it looks like they've gone away here, but I think that they're just really small. So I'm going to set this over to a wireframe mode so that I can zoom in on them a little bit. And then I'll go back to lit, and you'll see that they're all still there. They're just much smaller now. That's fine, we'll come back to that. Initial velocity sets the way that they're going. So by default, my start values are 10, 10, then 100 along z, -10, -10, and 50 along z. If I think they're moving too fast, I can slow them all down by making these numbers smaller. If I think they're too slow, I can speed them up by making these numbers bigger. That will give them more velocity. The last default that I have is color over life. This has 2 options. I've got color over life, and I've got alpha over life. Alpha is transparency. So with this one, I can come in here. I've got 2 points, 0.0 and 0.1. If I twirl these down, I get in values and out values. By changing the out value, I can make the particles become more transparent as they age. Similarly, color over life will allow me to come in and pick up the same 2 points, and now by changing their out values, I can change their colors. It's not going to do much while my particle is still set to being a little 3D plus sign. So in the next video, I'm going to go ahead and make a new particle material, and then I'm going to come back into my dust emitter and change it up. So I will be right back to make a particle material.